Welcome to the Report Card with Matt Malkus, where we evaluate research, policy, and practice efforts to improve the lives of families, schools, and students. Universities are obviously extremely influential in American culture, politics, and public discourse. But today, you hear a lot of critiques, especially on the right, that universities don't have enough true intellectual diversity, and that they often discourage controversial lines of inquiry. In fact, define what is controversial by whether it's in line with progressive university orthodoxy. Now, if you're somebody that buys that premise, the question is, what should be done? Well, in a recent National Affairs article, two of my colleagues at AEI, Rick Hess and Brendan Bell, took on that question and came out with a bold proposal that conservatives and others excluded from progressive university monoculture need an ivory tower of their own. Now, you hear arguments like this a lot, I know, but Rick and Brendan go way beyond airy notions of universities are too left. They get down to the brass tacks to determine what it would take to build a new university. A proposal that deals with things like square footage, total costs, and where to get this faculty. Spoiler alert, it's not cheap, but it's not necessarily impossibly expensive either. To talk about what I think is a compelling proposal, I brought on Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy here at AEI, and Brendan Bell, our Program Manager. And to help kick the tires on it, I also asked Steve Tellis, Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University and a self-proclaimed non-conservative, to help us make sure we don't have a monoculture of our own. So without further ado, let's welcome Rick, Brendan, and Steve. Rick Hess, Brendan Bell, Steve Tellis, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here, man.
All right. So Rick, Brendan, y'all wrote an article called An Ivory Tower of Our Own. You put out a call to start, just to research one university from scratch. That's $3.4 billion, I think, answer to a problem. So my question, Rick, just to lay this out, what's your $3 billion problem you're trying to solve?
The fact that when you are talking about issues in the academy that touch on values, that touch on viewpoints, that there is a massive imbalance, one that verges on a functional orthodoxy as to what is appropriate to talk about when it comes to affirmative action, when it comes to gender issues, when it comes to school discipline, when it comes to abortion, when it comes to Arab-Israeli relations. The academy does a moderately good job of creating room for people to have data-based disagreements about some of these questions. But when it comes to interpretations of those data, when it comes to framing arguments, it turns out, having spent close to 30 years now in and around a series of public and private institutions, that I have found remarkably little room for dissent on these questions. And further, what I have found in 15 plus years at AEI is I've had the opportunity to mentor a series of brilliant, academically inclined individuals, and the ones who are conservative really find no place to go to in the academy. I think fostering what feels like a closed loop, where the people who go in tend to broadly share some priors. If you are to the right of the spectrum along the way, you have trouble finding mentors, you have trouble assembling a research committee, you have trouble getting hired for a job, you have trouble winning fellowships, and so you tend to wind up at places like AEI or conservative think tanks or conservative magazines. And what we wind up with is, I think, a vicious cycle that doesn't do anybody any good in terms of robust and heterodox discussion about things that matter.
So to help listeners to make sure that your article isn't just a guy who's conservative complaining that the academy's liberal, you're not just saying, it's liberal. You're talking about a problematic production function, right? Can you draw that out a little bit more?
Sure. So a lot of what conservatives have done over time is they've just given money to universities because there's a lot of great universities in America. And if you're supporting research on cancer, it doesn't really matter if you give it to an institution that has some kind of orthodoxy in the humanities or social sciences. But there's also a lot of conservatives who would like to see more academics who are taking the other side in disputes over Western culture, over whether masculinity is toxic. And what they have generally done is they have given to individual programs like Robbie George's James Madison shop at Princeton, or they have given to programs at universities like George Mason, or they have funded specific fellowships, or they have supported groups that have sought to create room for free speech and for viewpoint diversity on campus. And these things are all good. In the piece, Brendan and I say this is great. The problem is if you have institutions where there's a center of gravity on the faculty, where especially among graduate students and postdocs, there are normal ways of thinking and being. If you're dealing with publications and professional associations and fellowship opportunities, much less provosts and board of directors and alumni networks that share certain things in common, all of these efforts wind up feeling very much like you're pushing against the tide. So what Brendan and I talked about in this national affairs piece is what would it look like to try to create at least one, ideally more than one, but at least one epicenter that could actually provide a home, a respite, a place where scholars, not just conservative scholars, but scholars who wanted to tackle questions in unconventional ways, who wanted to challenge prevailing orthodoxies, wouldn't have to worry about whether or not they were going to get the office across from the dumpster, wouldn't have to worry about whether that was going to sink their tenure case, would be able to host convenings without worry that their guests were going to be shouted down or chased off campus by those hostile. And so really what this is an effort to think about intellectual diversity, not just within existing institutions, but by creating intellectual diversity among institutions in a way that was once actually part and parcel of the fabric of American higher education, but which over the last 50 years or century has decreasingly been part of the way we think about changes in higher ed.
So, Steve, I want to bring you in here. Now, I'll pitch it to you. Are you a conservative?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so that sort of matters for this. So, as a self-described non-conservative, how do you take Rick's framing of the problem?
So, I always describe myself on these as a liberal, but who, where conservatives in the academy is concerned, is like a righteous Gentile. You know, my position is that we should have half of the Republicans we currently have in Congress and at least double the number we have on campus. That's my preferred position. You know, I think this is a really tricky problem of social evolution. One way to think about this is there was already a problem when Rick and I were in grad school way back in the day, but I got my PhD in 1995. Rick, you got yours, what?
97.
Right, 97. So we were pretty highly overlapping. Now, Harvard, if you go back to the early 80s, right, you would have had quite a number of conservatives who you could have studied with, right? You could have studied with James Q. Wilson, Ed Banfield, Sam Huntington at Harvard. There would have been more, right? Pat Moynihan earlier back in the 70s would have been around and actually mentored a lot of conservatives. And a lot of the people who are the most important conservatives who are still in political science came out of that era. One of the big problems right now is that number at elite institutions. And again, there's a real power law distribution in the places that produce people who can get jobs at elite institutions, right? And Rick has some data in this, like in history, right? The top 10 departments and even more, right, the top 5 produce an enormous percentage of those who go into those positions. That itself is a problem. And one of the big problems, though, now is there's a combination of the presence of discrimination and the perception of discrimination. So the presence of discrimination matters, but in a way, I think conservatives have not done themselves very well because they've created the perception among conservative potential students that the situation's so bad that they're not going to even try. I actually think the situation is bad, but not as bad as conservatives have made it out to be.
So there may be places to go, but per Rick's point, there's no epicenter.
There's no epicenter. One of the questions, and again, I've read this piece with rabbinical care for a number of times. So I've read it very, very, very carefully. One of the problems is the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has this idea of distinction, that one of the main things that institutions of higher education do is they have what he called a social deeming function, right? Like almost in the medieval era where somebody would, put a sword to your shoulders and deem you part of the sort of knightly class. And only a few institutions have that power in modern society. And I think in some ways that shrunk, right? The process that Rick has described earlier when the University of Chicago and my own Johns Hopkins were created was an era in which that process of distinction was a lot more up for grabs than it is now. And one of the questions is, if you dump $3 billion into creating a whole university like this, even if you're paying your faculty an enormous amount and you're drawing on their own sort of status, will that institution have the social deeming function that it's going to allow it to do what Rick is describing? And I think there's some reasons to question that. And I think there's examples where conservatives have tried to create their own parallel social deeming function. I'll make some people uncomfortable and say the Bradley Prize is an example of that, right? People are saying, oh, we need our own MacArthur, Genius Award, right? And so people put a lot of money into creating a prize, and I don't think it's worked, right? I don't think it's been able to actually give people any impression that these people are geniuses in the way that the MacArthur Prize does, right? Because it turns out there isn't that same distinction or prestige. You can't just make it up from scratch by spending money, right? And that's, I think, one of the questions, at least I have, about whether this is going to work, right? And first of all, if you put all this money into it, you get all these people to do it, you get all these grad students to show up, are other institutions going to treat them as equivalent to Harvard and Princeton and Yale graduates?
Yeah, well, they deem them as.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of the most interesting examples are places like NYU, which was a commuter school as recently as the 1980s, and which today, actually, its brand carries a lot of weight. Washington University, folks used to ask, is that by Seattle or Washington, D.C.? Within 20 years, it had actually turned into a recognizable place. I would argue on the right, more specifically, I think Steve's point on the Bradley Prize is fair, but I think there are also creations of the right, like National Review or the American Enterprise Institute, which takes folks, with AEI say, we routinely take folks who are not welcome in academe, and they wind up being relatively influential voices in major newspapers and broadcast media and elsewhere.
Let me ask it a couple of even more tough questions here, right? One of the differences with National Review or AEI is, in a way, they're working more in a situation that's a little more like a market, right? And in a way, so I wrote a whole book called The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement that had a chapter in the Federalist Society, which I think to some degree was quite successful in helping to diversify law schools. But one of the differences there is law schools, at least at the elite level, do have something of a market, right? They have federal judges. And there's a lot of prestige that's associated with federal judges, right? Being able to place your people with federal judges into clerkships. The clerkships then also have a lot of prestige in getting jobs on faculties, right? So you're working with at least a little bit of a slightly different market than you're working in with social sciences and humanities. Even if you created an institution like this, and again, I'm open to this. I think it's probably a good idea, but to deal with this, you're going to have to deal with a lot of really tricky, difficult questions. This only works if all the existing people who Rick thinks are discriminating, right?
Hold on, Steve.
But please finish.
Wait a minute. But you've read the piece carefully, right? We actually very explicitly say that this is not about discrimination. We say that these are about behaviors. There are norms and routines at campuses. 60 years ago, it was the same. It was the other direction. If you weren't a military historian and you wanted to work at Yale or Princeton or Harvard back then, you were pretty much frozen out. You couldn't do social history. It wasn't that anybody sought to discriminate. It's that academia is built around a sour of interlocking power structures and routines and norms. And if you actually want to upend that, partly that begins by people who need to find a place where they can get their foot in, where they can host convenings, where they can host journals. You need some of this infrastructure to have even a chance to start these other balls rolling. So I just want to be clear that we're not talking about some kind of invidious, persecution complex and some story of wild-eyed discrimination.
So first of all, I think there is, in fact, a significant degree of discrimination, right? If you look at the data on whether or not faculty members say that they would never support a conservative being hired to their department, a significant number say yes, which in itself is remarkable, right? Because nobody ever admits that they're discriminatory. That's why
reports of that.
Right. So it itself is remarkable that many people just up and say it. But disparate impact is a mechanism of discrimination, right? If you create systems that are systematically biased toward insiders and against outsiders, that itself, right? Our whole law recognizes that that's a form of discrimination, which is why we have the whole idea of disparate impact in the law. And I think this is, in a way, you're describing a gigantic structure of disparate impact, right? But again, even in the case of military history, right? Again, which I think it's a scandal that military history is so understudied in elite institutions. If you went and created the parallel institution and then said, oh, well, one of the things we want to have a lot of people coming out, having done military history, all those existing systems, right, that have their own determinations of what's important and what's not important, right, they would then have to hire these people, right? And so I'm not saying that's impossible. This is what
happened. I mean, when you look back at some of those shifts in the 50s and 60s, when military history went from this kind of dominant orthodoxy to something that looked to be more akin to a healthy diversity, to when it got kicked out kind of, butt over tea kettle. That all started because there were, in fact, hubs of the left, places like the New School and such, where you actually saw folks getting trained who could launch it. Part of the problem here is that if you look around the top 30 or 40 intellectual conservatives in kind of American public life, those who have PhDs are, very rarely actually have a foot that is comfortably in the academy, partly because there's not even a place to get that ball rolling.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we got a chicken and egg thing that is not the case, for instance, with law schools, because there is a place to go outside of the academy that may be more diversified. But we're talking about a $3 billion investment here. And one of the things that is really interesting about the piece is that it's not up in the clouds. It's not like, we should just spend a bunch of money. But you guys actually sort of got in touch with people to say, what would it take to put something like this together? So, yeah. Brendan, can you just quickly take us through that? Because it's really an interesting part of this equation.
Sure, yeah. So we talk to people who actually do this stuff, university architects, engineers, and the first thing you have to do is acquire land and build on it. So that alone, we found would cost about $1.5 billion. So there are two parts to that. The first is acquiring the land. We sketched it out outside of, say, a Houston or a Denver area, and that would cost about $10 to $20 million. And then the second piece is the construction, and that's far more expensive. $1.4 billion to construct a full campus and residence halls and such.
Right. And so this is just how from scratch you guys started, yes. Right? Like bare ground, and you're going to go starting with infrastructure and then $1.34 billion actual campus. And then you got to fill it.
You got to fill it. And the logic for that, if listeners are saying, well, wait a minute, it's the 21st century, and Steve has raised this point, why the heck take on all of this overhead and infrastructure? And that's a fair question. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways you can think about designing it. Part of what we think is, to answer Steve's question, there is this social construct around it. And if you want an institution that over 20 or 25 years can grow to be seen as significant and prestigious enough that it's going to attract talent and it's going to play this substantial role, it's going to be hard to do as a virtual entity. It's going to be hard to do as a place that just does a couple of disciplines. So part of the logic here is just to give people who are interested in the idea and the possibility a sense of what it would look to really try to build out Cornell or Duke starting from scratch.
So now you got an R1 campus, right, for your $1.5 billion, roughly, give or take.
Yeah, step two, faculty. So we had about 500 faculty, and those would be departments that would range from about 40 to 50 for larger departments in the social sciences, down to around 20 for some of the secondary and tertiary departments.
And interestingly, you guys said you're not going to pay market rate for this.
We're about 1.5 times market rate on average. So that's looking at about $250K for our full professors, and then around $180 for associate professors and $120 for assistants.
And the logic for paying 50% above market?
You have to attract talent, and especially if you're going to do this outside of in a new university, something that's an unknown, we have to be above sticker price.
All right. This is making sense so far now. You got some professors, you got some other missing pieces. How do you fill those?
Yeah, I mean, a university isn't a university without students. So we have about 6,000 total students, about 4,000 undergrads, and about a little over 2,000 grad students is the way we sketch this up. The undergrads would be giving us about $100 million in revenue each year. We'd be charging about $25,000 at the discounted rate. So sticker price close to $50K, but then with scholarships and financial aid would be about $25,000
and these are based on real numbers. These
real
are
numbers.
Real
exactly.
R1 universities are actually bringing in per student.
Precisely,
okay.
Yeah.
And then you have some support staff, and you're saving a little bit of money on there. Can you
Yeah, that's one area. We bulked up on faculty salaries, and we figured there's a lot of administrative bloat. You've probably read about different instances of that time to time. So that's one area we cut back, but tried to keep the core, administrative and staff, positions.
Partly what we did is if, for instance, you go to federal data from institutions of higher education, what we did is took the allocation that they typically invest, for instance, in social sciences and humanities, research support and convening, and we doubled that. More than doubled that. But a lot of these on-campus functions, I think many of us have said, you know what, if you can start from scratch, there's non-trivial savings to be gained in some of those places. And we unapologetically tried to harvest some of those savings.
Yeah, and I like it. I just want to commend the piece. National Affairs, Ivory Tower of Your Own. We're not ending now. I'm just saying you can find more about exactly how you broke it down by the pieces, gave some rationale for it, which is nice. I've never seen anything that just sort of like breaks down the operations side.
Well, let me actually raise. So I've raised this question with Rick before. So if I assume that this was the thing you would do if you were trying to solve this problem, there's still a bunch of questions in their description of, well, what does it have to be a university? We said, well, we all know what an R1 university is, right? But so much of the problem that they're describing is a problem of the pipeline of people becoming academics, right? And then they went and spent a ginormous amount of money training undergraduates. Now, first of all, I think there's a really fundamental question of whether it made sense to have combined these things together in the first place, right? So Johns Hopkins, when it started, was an almost exclusively graduate institution, and that's because it was modeled on the German research university. And German research universities, for the most part, still, they have a whole segment of institutions that are just graduate in research. The American Liberal Arts College was a great innovation. R1 university that combines undergraduates and graduates, I think, was a very problematic and increasingly pathological institution. So I think a lot of the costs, when you actually look at what they talk about in the article, are costs that are associated with things that only are there because you're doing undergraduates. And I think there's a really good argument to have this institution be a real path breaker and saying, let's go back to the idea of a purely graduate and research institution. If you've got this amount of money, one of the problems is that those undergraduates produce a very large amount of giving over time, but over a very long period of time. So there's a long tail to that. You're training these undergraduates now. It's only 20 or 30 years until they start becoming revenue positive for you, right? That's pretty far out in the future when you're trying to solve a problem that's right now.
So, Rick, in this thought experiment about how you set this up, I'm assuming you guys thought about this. And, why'd you come down where you came down? And how much confidence did you have in that model?
Yeah. No, these are all trade-offs. Steve's points are all terrific ones. The larger agenda behind this piece is really to get folks having this conversation rather than only the conversations about how do we try to get existing campuses to be more tolerant of viewpoints and lines of inquiry that are uncomfortable to pursue. Steve has enumerated a bunch of really good points. There's stuff on the other side. One of the questions that comes up, will faculty want to do this? Would they want to walk away? A number of faculty actually like the presence of undergrads. They like that as part of the job description. It feels like part of what they've gotten into this for, especially in something like the humanities. The reality is the faculty who don't like undergraduate teaching at places like this generally only teach one course a semester, so it's not an undue burden. A second part of it is there are folks who want something that feels like we've already got Bordeaux on the table. Let's get, Henry Giroux on the table. It feels like a real university, feels like it has these different components to it, that there are sciences, that they have colleagues across campus, that there's resources that they can go and touch base with that are present to kind of anchor the conversations, that create those conduits to the National Science Foundation. The third is, look, part of the pipeline mission here is to also identify folks and get them to go into grad school. So if you have a chance to touch 4,000 folks with the resources and critical mass and mentoring you've assembled, seems like a lost opportunity not to take that. Fourth, there's a concern already implicit in all of this that conservatives aren't cultivating their seed corn, that we absolutely have prominent conservative intellectuals. George Will's got his Harvard PhD, but they are not spending a lot of time or energy cultivating subsequent generations of thinkers. Part of that is grad students, but also part of that is undergrads. Steve pointed to the downstream revenue generation of alums, but there is also the social impact, the recruitment, the legitimizing function of alumni networks. And the reality is a lot of it depends on the organizing assumptions about physical plant and about staffing. But Steve raised this question of the enormous cost associated with undergrads. But actually, a lot of that starts to turn on projections about what you think the marginal revenue is from undergrads.
It is important to recognize beyond all these detailed things, right, that people like me should be ashamed of what universities have become, right? And the fact that even if it's a mistake and if it's not, completely true or it's overblown, right? The fact that conservatives don't believe they're welcome in major humanities and social science graduate programs, right, is something that we need to own as our problem, right? Is something that we did, right, either through sins of omission or commission. Now, one thing is an idea like this may be useful if only, right, to shock existing people who run institutions to realize, look, either we're going to get our own house in order, right, and make our universities a welcome place for conservatives to come and study, right, or they're going to go out and start creating their own institutions. Competition can matter even if it's not actual competition. The most important thing, I think, is those of us who are more liberal center or whatever, right, need to make clear, right, who we are that actually want conservatives to come and study with us. So I'll say in this podcast, anybody who wants to come and study American politics, public policy, we have great programs in political economy and comparative politics at Johns Hopkins, right? We would love to see applications from you. But more faculty need to go out and say that, because part of the problem is people, like Rick's research assistants who are thinking about this don't even know where the places that are in fact open to them and that aren't, right? And so I'll give one example. So I was advising a conservative potential grad student a few years ago who was looking at programs in sociology. And she was really interested in poverty, interested in all those kinds of questions, right? But she was very worried that she would go into a program and would be, she'd somehow get in under the radar, right? And then it would turn out to be really hostile. And so one function I did is I said, let me go and talk to a bunch of people to get this sort of what's really inside information, because it's hard to know from the outside what kind of departments are like that and what are not. Now, it turns out there are actually a lot of sociology departments that would be perfectly happy to have conservative students, and I figured out who they were. That's private information in a sense, right? It's not information that would be easily available. That's the kind of thing that there needs to be a lot more, right? The people like me who have that inside information need to be able to work with existing conservatives about potential grad students and help them sort through that. So I think the approach that Rick is describing and alternatives, right, in some cases may be complements rather than rivals, but I don't think you have to wait around for the decade or so it would take to build an institution like this for people like me to actually do something about this problem.
Rick, let me ask you a question that I think brings this to a point, and you might bristle at it if it comes from somebody else. Are you trying to start a conservative university?
No, I'm trying to create a place where we can talk about the things that if you try to talk about them as a serious scholar on a lot of campuses today, you will have students who try to shout you down. We saw this with our colleague Sam Abrams, for instance, just a couple of weeks ago. He did a survey of career counselors or what have you at institutions of higher education, noted the student life advisors, that these folks are disproportionately left, shared some of the takeaways in the survey. He had students demanding he be fired from campus. His administration failed to back him up. And this is not an atypical. In fact, my experience is how I got genially escorted off of University of Virginia campus once upon a time by folks who were very happy to see me go. While I was there, I interviewed at Harvard and Columbia and Vanderbilt. The overwhelming response to each of my visits to those places when they were trying to bring me in for jobs was, this guy's coming in over our dead body. The response to Brendan and my piece about 9 days after publication in the Stanford Social Innovation Review was, rather than Steve's kind of thoughtful and reflective, hey, this is interesting, I think it's maybe not the best way to go, but it raised some issues. Instead, in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, they talked about the intent and strategy of American oligarchs. They denounced me for my efforts to dismantle, and Brendan for our efforts to dismantle democracy, noted that we will be condemned by history, and somehow linked us to the killing of 1 million Irish to die of starvation. Though I wasn't entirely clear on the
causal chain is murky there.
Murky at best. But this is the problem that we're trying to solve for. And the reality is, again, it's important not to conflate two things. I think social science at most serious research institutions, by and large, if you are arguing about coefficients with policy implications, they do a passable job of creating room for scholars who are going to argue what these things show in my world about charter schooling, about accountability systems, about design of Pell Grants. I think they do an abysmal job, again, sticking with things I know best, on something like Title IX enforcement or Obama-era guidance on school discipline. When these issues go to deeply held values and views, things that we crudely label ideology, but that really are much more to our norms and priors, I think there are absolutely faculty across this nation like Steve, and there are absolutely programs and institutions where you can do that stuff. But I think by and large, there are clear right and wrong answers on most campuses and in most higher ed, social science, and humanities departments, and that it is really problematic if you have the wrong answers. I think Brendan and I are arguing one important component of this larger effort to address all of this is to create a place where you can get those wrong answers without fearing for your career, fearing for your ability to feed your family, fearing that your work will never be heard and consign you to irrelevance.
Right. And one thing I'll just say is it would literally be impossible to create a conservative university in this sense, right? That is, if you wanted to be an R1 that's going to be competitive with Harvard and Yale and Princeton in terms of placing students, right? I've looked very carefully into this, right? There are not enough conservative faculty to staff that institution. If by me, you mean the kind of people who would be tenurable at a place like Johns Hopkins. There just aren't that many conservative, especially in terms of the distribution across subfields in different areas, right? If you're talking that kind of thing, right? So in sociology, you would need people who did sociology, culture, and organizational sociology, right? This actually would only work, right, if it got significant buy-in from the righteous Gentiles, right, who will be at least 50%, if not more, of the faculty just because of the demands of actually having to staff an institution like this, right? So I do think if anybody was serious about doing this, right, you would have to build this thing right from the beginning, right, to not be the heritage or AEI, right, of universities, right? People have done that, right? And there's some okay institutions like that, right? But they're very far down on the status chain in American higher education. So you would need an entirely different model to be able to attract the kind of faculty who would mostly not be conservative to run an institution like this.
Well, here's the rub that I think that I'm really interested in is you quote O'Sullivan's law, right? Which is if it ain't right, it's going to go left. And that's the real challenge here, right? I mean, is this possible? And that is the question that I'm sort of left with at the end of the day is, do you have to have a purposefully conservative sort of bulwark to stand the tide? Or will this just eventually sort of follow the vast majority of the peer institutions, at least is the way the problem has been laid out?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating question. Trying to do this without building an institution that is explicitly conservative for the reason, Steve raises good and true issues on that score. There is a higher ed marketplace, and I do believe, based partly just on response we've received to this, not only from conservatives, but from Steve's righteous Gentiles, that there are folks, I think, who are hungry for opportunities like this. We talk about diversity a lot. I mean, one form of diversity is different kinds of institutions where you can raise some uncomfortable questions without necessarily having your colleagues, look at you like what the hell you were thinking. I'm not saying that 10% or even 1% of American higher ed should be that. But I think on a landscape with thousands of institutions, one institution like that might very well be welcome. I think if you charter that institution with a board, with leadership, again, this alumni network question, if you cultivate an alumni network that lends ballast, I think you can make an argument that it is possible to create this kind of institution with enough ballast, with enough path dependency, that it actually has a market advantage by clinging to this mission in a certain way. But these are good and important questions.
I think a lot of this conversation, one thing it points to is getting $3.6 billion and building a lot of physical plant is the easiest part of this project. Because, this is a kind of social problem that is made harder by the fact that we're not starting at zero. Again, I'm a what's called a historical institutionalist in social sciences. And we always emphasize, right, that all social problems start with the status quo. We're already starting every social problem in midstream, right? And the midstream we're starting in is, one, generally recognized conceptions of distinction. Two, the existing allocation of faculty, right? And who's actually out there who you would hire. When you take all those things, right, that's the bigger challenge to solve. And I think, again, even if nobody ever builds this $3.6 billion university, again, there's lots of people with $3.6 billion. I don't want to understate how big a problem it is to get $3.6 billion, but that for me seems like the least significant problem. One thing it should do is actually shake up people's conceptions of what sort of organizational innovations you might do here. An alternative to this would be to create something more like the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, right? That's another model that you could draw on, right? You could imagine creating something like a larger committee on social thought like they have at the University of Chicago, right? One advantage of that is there, maybe you're leveraging some of the existing status and prestige of those institutions, their resources, all those other things, right? If a university president said, I read Rick's article, I don't want him to go out and create that university, right? But, we can get a donor who's going to create an institution with 200 people to create a very large interdisciplinary school of social sciences and humanities in our university. That's a much smaller lift. It has a lot fewer of the problems that you get with having to create an entirely new institution that's going to be producing its own distinction. Now you have the problems of whether the existing faculty be willing to allow for this to have veto points. But university presidents have a lot of power in creating new stuff, not so much in getting the old stuff to do new things, right? But creating new things, they have a lot of power, right? And so, again, a function, I think, of this article should be to shake people's sense of what kind of institutional innovations you might pursue to deal with this problem.
Yeah, and it's a great article. It's a fairly easy read in National Affairs. You can just search it online on Ivory Tower of Our Own. And $3.6 billion, you just need 2 Mike Bloombergs. Didn't he give $1.8 billion recently to Johns Hopkins? Just got to find 2 of those guys. And if you can do one of these like halfway deals, you just talk to Mike.
Well, and I think, you visit Steve's neighborhood, right? I mean, it sounds like his neighbor's got this kind of cash. And look, there's also just, for I think Brendan and I, there's a sameness to sitting around and lamenting things that frustrate us about the world. And there's this tendency, certainly in 2019, to imagine conspiracies and vent grievances and to dream up grandiose policy solutions that policymakers aren't going to enact. So I think partly here, too, it's simply, look, something that I think the conservative movement was better at 15, 20 years ago than it is today is saying, what are a bunch of ways we might try to solve this problem? And then let's have robust conversations about the strengths and the weaknesses and costs and benefits. And that's really what we're trying to do here. We're not suggesting, as we've said, this instead of ongoing efforts to improve existing campuses. We're not encouraging this in lieu of something else. What we're saying is this seems like a potentially promising strategy. And I think conservatism, certainly across the breadth of education and probably across domestic policy in general, would be well served if those of us who have the opportunity, the privilege to sit around and read stuff and think stuff, were spending more time saying, hey, here are Tocquevillian ways to solve some of these problems. Here's private actions that we can undertake. And here's why they might actually have big outsized positive effects. And I think if we spent more time doing that and less time lamenting the state of the world, we might actually start to find some promising components of an agenda looking forward.
Well, thanks for the compelling article. Thanks for coming, Rick and Brendan, and talking about it. And Steve, thanks for being our righteous Gentile for today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Nat.
Thanks, bud.
Thanks for listening to the Report Card. And special thanks to our guests, Rick Hess, Brendan Bell, and Steve Tellis. This podcast would not be possible without the help of a team of producers and editors, including Sophia Gallo, Macy Heath, and Cody Christensen. Remember, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. And, of course, if you enjoyed the Report Card today, don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes or Google. If you have any questions, comments, or topic suggestions for future episodes, reach out to us at ed.podcast@aei.org. Until next time, I'm Nat Malkus.